Maurasse is one of the most outstanding both intellectuals of modern urban America, as well as one of the most insightful and creative practitioners working with the private sector, working with foundations, who is putting together best practices for the enrichment and empowerment of urban communities. He has much to offer us, and we should be very grateful to have him here as our first speaker in the Harlem Heritage course. Dr. David Maurasse.
And I was told to speak for 20 minutes to you. And what I will do is talk a little bit about the book and talk a little bit about why I was interested in writing this particular kind of book, and say a bit about contemporary Harlem and how it's evolved, and talk a little bit about some of the resident perspectives that I encountered in doing this particular research, which you saw in Listening to Harlem. Listening to Harlem is an overview of some of the recent changes in Harlem, and it is an analysis of urban economic and community development and the ways in which that kind of development actually has an impact on communities, and the way in which communities, particularly longtime residents, experience these kinds of changes, and the ways in which they get involved in the community to try to ensure that the kinds of changes that are taking place in their neighborhoods are actually going to be of benefit to them, which I think is a critical part of this particular overview in looking at Listening to Harlem. Overall, my sense of looking at the evolution of Harlem over the last few decades is one that those of us who are in New York see on a regular basis, change which you might be able to see almost before your very eyes. Thinking about where Harlem was in the middle 1980s to where it is right now, you see an area that is relatively dramatically different. When people used to talk about Harlem in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, they began to think of Harlem as a place where they'd never want to go, where they'd want to retreat, from which they'd want to retreat, and a place that they considered scary, a place that they considered violent. And of course, all along, there have been residents living in the community for generations. There were some residents who did leave Harlem, but there were many residents who didn't. What we began to see in the 1990s was a shift in terms of the focus on Harlem. That we began to see people who in 1985 would have said, no, never, I'll never live in Harlem, or no, never, I will never invest in Harlem, all of a sudden begin to take interest. And we began to see a number of rapid changes in the way in which this particular neighborhood has changed. It's very interesting when we think about Harlem. All urban neighborhoods change in some way, shape, or form over time. And when we think of the process of what's known as gentrification, we sometimes see rapid change in urban neighborhoods. But imagining Harlem and its sheer size, the fact that it covers 3 city districts, the fact that it has a few 100,000 people as residents, make it a very unique kind of place in terms of urban change. So to imagine the kind of change we've been seeing in Harlem happening over a short period of time really speaks to a number of dynamics and really suggests, well, what's the impact of these kinds of changes? Who's being affected by this? And daring to ask the question, who truly benefits from the kinds of changes that are taking place in Harlem right now? So when we think of the Harlem of the mid-1990s up to now, we think of a Harlem where there is increased interest, there is increased investment. You can walk on 125th Street and see businesses that you would see from any part of the country. You could see them on 34th Street, you could see them in a mall in some part of suburban America, whether it's Old Navy or any of the kinds of stores you see along 125th Street, and you see that kind of change. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is the fact that when we think about gentrification and those who have analyzed gentrification, we often look at it in, I think, a relatively limited way. We often look at it in terms of people, changes in demographics, and in terms of real estate, changes in the prices of real estate. Now, the very concept of gentrification does suggest a change in people. The very notion suggests that as a neighborhood gentrifies, you have the replacement of an old population with a new population that will be seen as a quote-unquote gentry. But what I've noticed in urban development in quote-unquote gentrifying neighborhoods all over the country, as well as in Harlem, is that there are other dimensions that are at work. I think in addition to changes in people and changes in real estate, we also see changes in business and also see changes in culture. Listening to Harlem began as a project that was going to look specifically at business-community relations in Harlem, and it grew to a more comprehensive view of the overall changes in the neighborhood and tried to take account of these key 4 categories in which there are significant dynamics taking place. And so when we think about real estate, of course this comes to mind for those who have tried to find an apartment in Harlem, those who have tried to purchase property in Harlem. In terms of residential real estate, we know the changes are dramatic. They're dramatic in New York City as a whole, and indeed that has had an effect on what has taken place in Harlem. But when you think about the fact that one could have purchased a shell of a building, which could be a brownstone that isn't developed in any way, just its overall structure, no windows, nothing else, something like that, even 10 years ago, might have gone for a few $100,000, which now would go for over $1 million. When we think about a rental housing market, we're talking about double, triple, quadruple in some instances the rate of change. And when we think about Manhattan as a whole, we're talking about 15% every single year in terms of the value of an apartment. And those rates are higher in terms of the changes in Harlem. So we're talking about a rapidly changing economic environment as far as real estate is concerned. And another critical piece that often gets overlooked in gentrification is that we see a critical change in commercial real estate as well, which I think is one of the more salient and interesting aspects of the changes that we're seeing right at this very moment in Harlem, which we can talk about. And talking in terms of that business dimension, that's critical as well. And maybe in Harlem it might be more critical than in some other urban neighborhoods, because Harlem is very much both commercial and residential, heavily residential, but it does have commercial thoroughfares. And anytime you think about a neighborhood, there are services in that neighborhood for that community. And those services are oftentimes, in some way, shape, or form, organized and coordinated by local businesses. And they could be for-profit businesses, and they could also be nonprofit businesses, which is another area that is often overlooked when we talk about neighborhood change. But thinking about what has happened from a business perspective, Harlem has historically been a place for small businesses. When we think in terms of the last few decades, we haven't thought about major multinational retail establishments being situated in Harlem. But we had an empowerment zone which in the middle 1990s brought new resources to Harlem. And in terms of developing an application for the empowerment zone, the intent was to bring jobs to the community. So in bringing jobs to the community, the expectation was that if you brought larger retail establishments, they would bring multiple jobs, right? So indeed, many of those larger retail establishments are in Harlem right now. But part of the question is, what kind of jobs did they bring? And to what degree have those jobs actually brought major economic advantages to the neighborhood? Now, certainly there are certain kinds of resources that people might not have been able to access that are now in the neighborhood because of some of these new retail establishments. But at the same time, we have seen a situation where many of the historic small businesses are no longer able to exist in Harlem because of increased prices. We do see new small businesses coming into Harlem as well, and new small businesses which in some ways actually are focused a bit more on a different kind of a clientele, which gets to the people dimension. And anytime we talk about urban development and urban change and gentrification, we always have to look at the concept of people. And often when those who are thinking about strategies for improving urban communities, we always have to raise the dual question of people and place. Do we create development initiatives that are for the existing people and for the place, or do we create development initiatives that are for the place and not for the existing people? And that has been one of the great tensions and the great ironies when people have talked about urban development. Because indeed, many of the longtime residents in Harlem have wanted to see changes in the neighborhood, have wanted to have fresh produce in grocery stores, have wanted to have access to ATMs, to bank machines, have wanted to have taxi cabs come into the neighborhood. There are many services that are necessities that have not been accessible to longtime residents. However, as some of the new resources have come into the neighborhood, there has been some sense among residents that maybe these new resources are not for the longtime residents, but for the residents to come. And indeed, as you could see in listening to Harlem, and as you can find in any demographic data on Harlem, there is a gradual change in terms of the demographics of the community, racially, economically, in terms of homeowners, in terms of whites moving into Harlem, and definitely in terms of a class dimension. And that's something that people often remind me of, that some of and many of the new residents to Harlem happen to be of African descent, but maybe of a different class than people who have been there for a long time. And all of these factors create some interesting dynamics. And I also think a cultural dimension is very important to take into account when we think about urban change. And of course, as you will hear throughout this course, the reality is that Harlem plays a very unique cultural role, not only in the United States, not only among African Americans, but in the world and among people of African descent all over the world. It has symbolically been, in some way, shape, or form, synonymous with the progress of people of African descent, with the culture of people of African descent. And so there is a uniqueness about Harlem, and it's that very uniqueness which has attracted people to the neighborhood from all over the world over the years. And so part of the question is the degree to which the development that's happening in Harlem now is actually, in some way, shape, or form, upholding some of the culture that has existed. And the reality is that change is going to happen. Everyone has to be prepared for change in some shape or form. And it's important to balance this conversation and say, yeah, obviously all neighborhoods evolve, all neighborhoods change, but the question remains in terms of what kind of change. So one of the things I sought to find out is the degree to which some longtime residents actually experience these kinds of changes that have been happening in the neighborhood. What's benefiting them? What's challenging to them? And what was very interesting is that there was indeed a very balanced view. And as you can see in listening to Harlem, one resident to the next, to the next, to the next does not think the same way. We're not talking about a uniform perspective on what's right and wrong about changes in the neighborhood. However, it did become clear that the kinds of things that many of the longer time residents do like about the neighborhood are the fact that there are some of those resources in place that weren't there before. There is a level of access that people might not have had before. People don't have to shop downtown, get on the subway, bring their groceries back home, and they can do it right in their neighborhood. There are some basic aspects of subsistence and everyday living that have been enhanced by a lot of the changes that have taken place in the neighborhood. And the fact that there is a greater attention to the neighborhood, there may be a level of feeling of safety in the community that people might not have had before, and even in terms of changing the demographics of the neighborhood, to have a community where there is a certain degree of mixed income means that people who are living in impoverished situations are not necessarily isolated, and that people are in some way integrated with those who have greater resources. So the kinds of changes that take place in these kinds of urban environments where you have a mixing of people from different economic and racial backgrounds, does have its benefits to a certain degree. But I think there is a certain insecurity about where the changes are going. I think there is a certain insecurity about what kinds of influence that people can have over the changes in the neighborhood. I thought the first thing that people were going to say was the prices going up. That's the thing that bothers people the most. And what became very striking to me is that was very much on people's minds was the issue of participation. The degree to which longtime residents felt they had a say in the kinds of changes that had been taking place in their neighborhood. And part of the irony of some of the changes that have taken place in Harlem is that it was the resident organizing on blocks that made a lot of the blocks in Harlem safer. And it was some of that resident organizing that made those blocks more palatable to people from the outside. And so there is a sense that people feel they toughed it out. They spent a lot of time in the neighborhood. They didn't move out when a lot of people were moving out. And now there's a situation where people may or may not be able to afford to stay in the neighborhood. Now, when we think about some of the units of real estate in terms of those smaller units in New York City, those smaller apartment complexes that may have 6 or fewer units, those units are very much up to the whim of the owner. So if there's a change in ownership in those residential units, it's up to the owner to decide whether or not residents stay. So there is rent control and rent stabilization in New York, but it doesn't apply to all types of buildings. So there are several buildings in Harlem where there is extreme vulnerability to residents. Many of the types of people who want to move into Harlem now are much more likely to want to make those kinds of apartment complexes single-family homes with one tenant, or single-family homes altogether. So there are lots of complicated dynamics that take place. And even for those who own, which is very interesting speaking to some of the longtime owners in the community, if they sell, could they remain in the neighborhood if they wanted to purchase something else in the neighborhood at the new prices? And that was a question for lots of people. So you have this sense of choice. And I think when we talk about empowerment of communities, when we talk about empowerment of communities that may not have historically had a great deal of access to resources, it's very important to look at issues of choice. And I think that while the demographics that some might see in Harlem have not demonstrated a radical change in terms of the numbers of people who've come in and the numbers of people who've left, it does suggest that over time we could begin to see something that approaches radical change because of the limited choices that a lot of longtime residents have. But overall, as I mentioned, one of the things that struck me was the degree to which many longtime residents felt that they really wanted to have more of a say in what goes on in the neighborhood, and felt as if their voices were not heard and that there were not opportunities for them to engage and not opportunities for them to shape where things would go from there. And with that, I will stop as I have taken my time and then take some of your questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Of the community members that you talked to that were concerned that their voices weren't being heard, was there a general consensus on what they wanted to see happen in the community, or were there more dissenting different opinions?
Definitely different opinions, but
Okay,
if you...
David, it may be helpful if you restated the question
Okay,
for everybody.
okay. You want to say the question again so I can then say it again?
I was asking of the community members that you spoke to that were concerned that their voices weren't heard, that they wanted to participate in what became of Harlem. Was there an overall idea among those members of what they wanted to see, or were they all
Of those, of those community members who felt their voices haven't been heard over time in Harlem, what are some of their ideas about changes in the neighborhood? Is there a consistent thinking among them? And I think the consistency more lies in the very process of involvement. And people not necessarily sure, which I think speaks to another dimension looking forward, not necessarily feeling sure they understood where they could participate and how they could participate and how they could have an influence outside of what goes on their own block. So there is a sense of civic engagement. There's a question around civic engagement that I think is important here. And anytime we see a neighborhood that is undergoing the kind of change that we're seeing in Harlem, you can see the value of having organized communities. Not to say that communities aren't organized in Harlem, but the reality is it's such a vast neighborhood, and the various spheres of change in terms of how the neighborhood is affected are in so many different environments. Now, there was a process around the empowerment zone, and that process did involve community residents. And this is something that is important to take into account, but the reality is which community residents got to be at that table. And how do you make those kinds of decisions? So I did speak to some residents who were actually involved in that process, as well as some who weren't. And so some who were involved felt to a certain degree that they were glad to be involved and they were glad to have been asked. But even they felt that in the end, it was not necessarily their voices that were going to make final major decisions. It was going to be voices that were more at the level of Congress, more at the level of businesses, and in terms of large corporations. So there is a varied sense to a certain degree of opinion, but there's also varied experience among some of the residents in terms of the degree to which they've been involved. But what I tried to do also in listening to Harlem was to talk a little bit about some of the various kinds of suggestions that residents and community-based organizations had in terms of trying to be involved in changing the neighborhood and trying to, which I think is an important point, when we do have situations where new resources are coming into neighborhoods that have experienced a history of disinvestment, how do the existing residents in that community and those kinds of communities take advantage of the resources that are coming in? So one of the suggestions that came out was the degree to which residents could actually sit down with some of the corporations that have an interest in coming into the community and talk to them about how to come to mutually beneficial conclusions about bringing certain kinds of resources to the community, but also being involved in different ways in the community. There was a sense that so much of the change that's been going on has been focused on, okay, we're going to develop real estate, we're going to bring in new businesses, we're going to bring jobs, but a lot of the residents want people to do things about the local schools. They want people to do things that are more focused on the social infrastructure of the community. And there's a feeling that some of that aspect of what's been going on is left out, which then contributes to the sense that the changes that are going on in the neighborhood are not as much about the priorities of the existing residents, but more about the place and about the residents to come. There are many hands here, and I don't know how to be fair. Yes, we'll go up front.
About the social structures that have been put in place with the existing residents in mind, specifically academic institutions like the Harlem Children's Zone, and how what is the feedback from those institutions in regards to what's taking place in the larger community? Because as the demographic rapidly changes with an institution like the Harlem Children's Zone, it caters to a 60-block radius of the existing Harlem community. So I'd be interested to know what the feedback was from Jeff Buchanan.
What is the feedback from community-based organizations like the Harlem Children's Zone about some of the changes that are going on in the neighborhood? And you will see in listening to Harlem that there is some featuring of some of the work of different community organizations, the Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement, Harlem Children's Zone. The Harlem Children's Zone has an initiative called Community Pride, which is featured in the book. And it was very intriguing to me to see this, because what Community Pride had done, and they provide a forum for local residents that are in that particular zone that the Harlem Children's Zone has carved out in the neighborhood, to talk about issues that are affecting the neighborhood and to try to collaboratively develop problem-solving strategies. One of the strategies that they developed was to take advantage of an old law that was never overturned, which was designed to allow people to take over city-owned buildings for very low rates and turn them into limited equity cooperatives. And what they were able to do was get quite a number of residents in that local community to actually own apartments in these cooperatives that were city-owned buildings that during the 1970s, and remember the evolution, during the 1970s and the 1980s, people wanted to leave Harlem. People wanted to get out of Harlem. People who owned businesses wanted to burn their businesses and get insurance money. People wanted to leave. And so they developed policy incentives to get people to stay. They wanted to encourage people to develop these buildings and get people to live in them so they wouldn't be abandoned, so they wouldn't become crack houses, so they wouldn't become all of these other things. And this law was still on the books. And the Harlem Children's Zone and the Community Pride Initiative took advantage of that. And many of the other organizations that focus on community and housing development in the neighborhood took advantage of some of those incentives for affordable housing development as well. And part of the challenge you will see in contemporary Harlem, very, very contemporary Harlem, is that many of those organizations that had been doing work like that have found themselves in an environment where there are dried up incentives to develop affordable housing. Much of the focus on housing development in Harlem right now is more on luxury housing, more on new condo developments. And in that very neighborhood where the Harlem Children's Zone works, you will see more activity than in other parts of Harlem in terms of some of the new buildings going up. It's very evident as you walk the streets in that particular part of town. Thank you. Yes?
What is your sense, and what sense did you gather about the stability and durability of this trajectory of change with like gentrification and capital and resources coming in and demographic change? Because I mean, like, I was talking to somebody in like this recent like housing downturn. I mean, I don't know the specifics of it, but like, is there a sense that it's just going to keep coming in and people are going to keep, communities are going to keep changing, or could then something turn around and there's disinvestment again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what is the sense of the cycle of change around housing values in communities and in these kinds of gentrifying situations? Is this something that is going to pass? And the real estate values will then go down, and then the neighborhood will stabilize again in terms of the rates of housing prices. That's always possible. And even today, there are questions about the degree of building and the degree to which some of those new condo establishments are going to be sold. There are some of those buildings that are not sold out. So even now, you can see some of those kinds of changes. Housing is always cyclical in that sense. And then you have to ask the question about the degree to which in certain markets you don't see the downturns. So if we look at the downturns that are going on all over the country right now, there are certain parts of the country where you're not seeing a downturn, where you're seeing stabilization in terms of increases in pricing of housing. And one of those areas is Manhattan, right? So Harlem has always been Harlem, and Manhattan has been south of Harlem. But is there a Manhattanization of Harlem? to the point where Harlem is now a part of that Manhattan exception, and those rates will stay at a very high level. Certainly the rates of increase in housing prices in Harlem are affected and have been affected by the rates of increases in prices in housing all over this region. So when there are residents talking about those who have left Harlem as a result of increases in pricing, I asked, where did they go? And the answers were rarely just down the street. Were rarely 2-3 miles away. Were often Virginia, North Carolina, South Jersey, Philadelphia. It's a much broader range. So one of the real interesting realities of the development around Manhattan and around New York City is that the desire to be in New York City and the New York City metropolitan area is so high that people are commuting into New York City from Philadelphia. I was told that was one of the recent trends.
That's right.
I know there was a straight line, yes, privilege.
All right, 2 questions. About 5 years ago, a administrator at Columbia, I won't say his name, but he's very prominent. He's no longer in that position. Said to me that the Harlem that's in your imagination, you know, the Harlem Renaissance, the Harlem of the Savoy Ballroom of the 40s, the Harlem of the the Black Arts movement of the 60s, no longer exists and definitely will not exist in the next 20 years. And if you think about it, at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, Harlem was overwhelmingly either ethnically Jewish, you had Irish, some Germans, and Italians. And East Harlem was overwhelmingly Italian and to some extent Jewish. And remained that until the Puerto Ricans began to move in later in the 20th century. But there was a time when Harlem was overwhelmingly white. It only became overwhelmingly black in the 1920s and 30s. But even then, it had substantial white population. Can you envision a time in the future when blacks represent a minority of the population of Harlem due to the trends of gentrification? That's kind of question 1. When will Harlem cease to be black? To put it mildly.
Yes. Should I take that now?
2.
Okay.
Manhattanville. All right. About 3 weeks ago, Community District Board 10, 9?
9 is west.
9, okay, had a meeting to discuss Manhattanville. I understand it was a lively affair. And they voted down Columbia's proposal. I wondered if you could talk about the evolution of Manhattanville, your take on it, and if you were talking to President Bollinger, what would you say to him about Manhattan?
Okay. First question, when will Harlem cease to be black? Next question, what is my perspective on Manhattanville and Columbia's intentions in that particular part of West Harlem? I'll take the Manhattanville first. You should know that a lot of my work has had to do with the role of universities in their surrounding communities. My first book, Beyond the Campus, is about that very topic, and I do speak quite frequently on that particular issue. So it is an issue that is very close to my heart, and I have some general ideas about what I perceive to be promising practices, let's say, in terms of university community partnerships. I think successful university community partnerships very much due, as I was mentioning about the residents' perspective in terms of working with corporations. Successful university community partnerships start with communication. They start with communication with surrounding stakeholders, whether they are residents, whether they are local businesses, local community-based organizations, local government. And the reason they should start with partnership and communication is because usually, even in a very contested space, you can find some mutual benefit out of those kinds of negotiations. So if Columbia University wants to develop the western swath of land alongside the more central part of Harlem from the 120s to the 130s, which is known as Manhattanville, which has historically been zoned as pretty much an industrial area. It's not necessarily residential. If Columbia University wants to develop in that area, there are clearly benefits to be had by Columbia, but there could also be benefits to be had by the community. So my thinking on Manhattanville is that whatever happens in that particular swath of land should be mutually beneficial to both the community and to Columbia University. The way that conversation has evolved from the point at which the Manhattanville plan was rolled out to now, where there is tension, and as Professor Marable mentioned, the community board has struck down the proposal. There were dimensions of communication and partnership that did not take place in the way that I think effective university community partnerships unfold. And the first challenge was the degree to which the plans were rolled out. So the plans were presented and then defended, as opposed to presented as an idea that may be beneficial both to the community and the university, and one that would be finalized out of dialogue and partnership. What has happened over time is that when the plan was rolled out, there was response from the community. There was a fair amount of negative response from the community. And as was mentioned in terms of the book and in terms of how residents have been feeling about changes in Harlem, people want to be involved. People want to participate. People want to be asked what would be good for the very neighborhood in which they are living. And so ultimately, the plan was defended and there was a lot of debate. And then ultimately, it was concluded that what was needed was a community benefits agreement. A community benefits agreement to determine potential mutual benefit between the development and the community. That is something that could have happened from the very beginning, in my sense of that particular process. So that's that answer. The other answer in terms of can Harlem or will Harlem cease to be black? As a geographical space, Harlem has had different demographics over the years. And clearly, from throughout the 20th century, although Harlem had been black through most of the 20th century, there was always a sense that Harlem was a quote-unquote gateway, that Harlem was prime real estate because it had access to downtown Manhattan, access to the rest of the country going west, New Jersey and otherwise, access on the east side going out to the airports, going out to Long Island, out to Queens, and access to the north, going into the Bronx and into the suburbs. Very few places in Manhattan, no other place in Manhattan, has that kind of access. So Harlem, as a geographical space, was always thought of as strategic and always thought of as a place that needed to be developed. Before Harlem became black, there was over-anticipation in terms of what could happen in Harlem, and Harlem being envisioned as a suburb for a lot of white ethnics. And there was overbuilding, and they couldn't fill all of those units of housing. And there was anticipation about the building of the Interrapid Transit, IRT as we know it. And when that didn't happen, people began to leave. And ultimately, they were, okay, we can allow some of you all to come in, but we're going to charge you higher rates to come in at that. And then ultimately, Harlem became black. So I don't think there's any guarantee that that geographical space will always remain black. It is prime real estate. There are significant interests in that particular area. So part of the question is the degree to which preservation is a part of the agenda in terms of the long-term development of Harlem. And I think it is to the strategic advantage of Harlem as a neighborhood and many of those who live there to continue to take advantage of the cultural history and the significance of Harlem. When you think about tourists, I mentioned in listening to Harlem that Harlem has been often the second and sometimes the first choice among tourists to visit, particularly among tourists from other parts of the world, particularly among tourists from places like Japan and Germany. And people want to go to Harlem and visit Harlem not just because it happens to be in Manhattan, not just because it happens to be a convenient geographic space. They want to go to Harlem to see the churches. They want to see the history. They want to go to the Apollo. They know the history. They want to hear jazz. There is a sense that there are unique aspects of Harlem that are attractive. So on the one hand, yeah, it could change, but on the other hand, I think it's to the strategic advantage of the neighborhood and those who have interest in the neighborhood to preserve the culture and the heavy emphasis on African American history and the significance of Harlem to people of African descent worldwide.
Okay, let's do one more question. Whoever you want.
Well, I have really biased this side of the room, so I'm going to take you.
Okay. Well, you spoke to, how at first this listening to Harlem became an economic, emphasis, and then you realized that it became a more comprehensive issue. And looking at that and kind of answering his question too, how feasible do you think it is to preserve the unique aspects of Harlem culture and the social scene and changing simultaneously? Do you think that that's feasible? And in what ways what factors do you think are going to be required in order to maintain Harlem's culture and people and the great things that we love about Harlem?
Is it feasible to preserve Harlem's culture and people and those things we love about Harlem? Well, I do think it's feasible. I think it's definitely feasible. First of all, some of the new establishments that have come into Harlem have not necessarily focused on things other than black culture. Right? So there has been an interest among those who are moving into Harlem and some of the businesses that have come to Harlem in preserving that culture. So I think the continuation of that will be very important. I also think an understanding of that value, the value, as I had just mentioned, that can be gained by preserving that culture, especially thinking of the attraction, the generation of tourist dollars, the generation of activity can be very significant. There is a lot of cultural expression in Harlem that can be taken advantage of. I was recently working with the Urban Design Lab here at Columbia and the 125th Street Business Improvement District, which has been talking about making 125th Street a contiguous cultural corridor. And a part of that concept is to provide more affordable spaces for community-based organizations that are focused on preserving the history and culture of Harlem on 125th Street in order to bring a certain unique type of life and activity on that street. And that could be a significant revenue generator. A lot of neighborhoods around the country and world have used and leveraged the cultural history of a neighborhood to its long-term economic advantage by focusing on history, by developing cultural institutions, by developing museums and the like. So there are definitely opportunities to wrap in culture in the ongoing economic and community development of Harlem.
Okay. All right, let's give Dr. Maurasse a big round of applause.
Thank you.